But this guy would train. He would train half the year in Boulder. He would train in Cape Town in South Africa, because it's the southern hemisphere. And then the other half of the year, when it was cold, he'd come to Boulder half the year because he wanted to train at altitude. He wanted his runners, his marathon runners, to have trained at altitude. Interesting guy.
That's neat.
Haven't seen him for years. I don't know. Lance, what's happening?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we're waiting on some folks. It looks like we just got Commissioner Teskey.
Yeah, I think it looks like our chairman just joined us. That's who I was certainly waiting for. We do have a couple people that are absent today. So I know Christian wasn't able to attend, neither was Andrea, although she had a conflict until about 1. So if the conversation extends past 1, she's hoping to be able to join that latter half an hour. And then Kim is not well today, so we will be proceeding. I think we've got everybody else here online. So Chairman Teskey, if you're ready, we'll jump into content today.
Great, I'm ready, assuming you can hear me.
Can. Yeah. So thanks for joining us for the regular workshop schedule here. I do want to just acknowledge, you probably see here as well, that Councilmember McDaniel is joining in and listening today. I think wanted to avail himself of the conversation as you all continue to tick through and work through some of the conversations on marijuana related businesses. So I think Lance will largely carry today's conversation and probably take off a fair bit where we left off on cultivation last week. And certainly want to acknowledge too, so that I don't forget here at the end, but on our regular scheduled meeting for next Tuesday, we have converted that meeting into a workshop so that we can continue this conversation, assuming that we will need to spend some additional and significant time on this continuing matter. So with that, that is the only thing on our calendar today for workshop. And unless Chairman Teskey, you've got anything to add, I will just turn it over to Lance.
No, I think that covers it very well, Tamara. Thanks so much for the intro and ready to go.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Chair Teskey, and members of the Planning Commission. Today we'll be speaking about marijuana businesses again, and would just provide, before we dive in here, an update as to the decision that City Council made last night regarding the 2 ballot questions. The 2 questions, of course, related to taxation and then repeal of the past moratorium, and both of those were referred to the April 2021 ballot in the form that they were drafted for last night's discussion. And so certainly if Councilmember McDaniel would like to speak about that, we can do that, but just wanted to let you know that we are in a position to continue working on development of the regulatory ordinance and keeping that on track for Council's consideration. I think we're looking at potentially March, but not entirely sure on the direction of that.
Lance, on that note, I have one question. How did the city address the Tabor laws for the taxation element? There was at some point some discussion about how you would do that if you didn't know how many stores, or how would you would project those. And I ask mostly of, does that question then in turn sort of put any parameters as we start to think about the regulatory side as well?
Yeah, great question, Keith. And so the Tabor requirement, of course, is related not only to rate, but in terms of estimated revenue for a first year. And the number that we came to was 2.9 million, including both sales and excise, limited only to those special taxes. So not including increases on the base sales tax revenue. Certainly there is a question about the impact of that and the relationship between that and any regulatory ordinance. And I would suggest that that is probably more relevant on the excise side, insofar as cultivation is considered. And I know that one is probably the most contentious, and that more folks are on the fence about cultivation than others. I say that because what we've heard from other communities and what's observable in the data is that the elasticity for sales and use tax is very different than for excise tax, right? So a single store, the difference between 6 stores and 7 stores in terms of total revenue is probably pretty limited, in that we would anticipate the revenue being based primarily on demand, not just availability. The difference between 2 and 12 stores is probably substantial, but 1 or 2 stores isn't going to make as big of a difference on revenue. Whereas with excise tax, it very much does. We would anticipate that a single 40,000 square foot grow, which is about the size of the one you see out in Palisade there by the base camp, would yield approximately $800,000 annually in excise tax revenue. And so obviously the difference between 1 grow and 2 grows is substantially, it's large relative to that more elastic number on sales. Does that kind of get at your question there, Keith? You're muted, but I'll take that as a yes.
Yeah, not a factor that we need to consider in terms of how many stores and buffering and everything else. We're in the right ballpark, and we can just move on with the conversation that we started last week.
I think so, and would flag that the council did include in their recitals a number of stores, and that was 6 stores maximum, and that was in a recital, so it's a policy commitment for this council. It's not an actual binding component of the voter approved measure itself, and we can kind of get into the weeds on that. But today, my hope is that we, for the moment, set cultivation down. I know we had a very robust conversation on that. I provided you with a bunch of materials on odor mitigation. But given that on the 26th, we're going to have a lot of time to circle around on all of these topics, I wanted to do a discussion today on the other 2 license types under consideration. And those would be products manufacturing and sales. So if that works for everyone, I'll just give a little info on products manufacturing, which from a zoning perspective will probably be a more comparable to cultivation. And then we'll dive in on sales, ideally with the second half of the discussion today. So I will share my screen. Let's see. Can folks see that all right? Great. So again, we'll talk manufacturing and sales today. And last time we discussed cultivation. So the products manufacturer license is interesting for several reasons. One, it is certainly more involved than perhaps any of the other license types when it comes to building and fire code regulations. And that is because what these license types are is it's the intermediary between cultivated raw marijuana product to any of the array of finished products that are often sold at the stores. And so while cultivators sometimes sell their raw flower product to the stores, a fair amount of that product, and actually an increasing amount over time, is going to these product manufacturers. And exactly what these product manufacturers do varies widely based on the processes they use to make the products, as well as the actual product that they're intending to create. So for example, a products manufacturing license may include a business that takes concentrate, THC, and uses that in baking to create edibles, or infuses gummies with it. And that is probably on the low hazard end of the array of products manufacturing license. On the other end, we have the more volatile and often technically hazardous uses that are involved in actually creating some of those concentrates, distillates, tinctures, etc. And so there are processes that involve dry ice, butane, carbon dioxide, and others, a lot of times high pressure, a lot of flammable equipment, and substances that can be involved. But it's the one license type, the products manufacturer license that covers that entire gamut. And so when we look at zoning, it's not common, but certainly we could attempt to attend to the nuances within that license type. But generally speaking, we're talking about a very broad array as we address the products manufacturer. In terms of how the working group has addressed this, we heard from several experts in the building and fire realm on this, and looked perhaps even too in depth at the mechanisms that are used to actually process these products and then to control that. And so what the working group determined as their recommendation was that this is really an industrial use that, if it's appropriate, would only be appropriate in the I-1 and I-2 zone districts. Again, it should be indoor, which I think is a bit of a no-brainer. And then that one of the primary reasons for wanting products manufacturing is job creation, both direct and indirect job creation, given that these manufacturers have a lot of equipment and maintenance needs as well. It's important to flag that the excise revenue, which was a component of cultivation, is not relevant here on the products manufacturer. It's not applied to the products manufacturer. Certainly staff had a similar recommendation, but more concern about hazardous uses and fire suppression. So we'll be getting a conversation going in earnest now with the building department on that. So with that kind of general information, I think I would just pause for any questions about what this license is, and then let's maybe start a discussion about to what extent they're appropriate and where.
I'll start with maybe an easy one, but there's a coffee shop in Palisade, for example, that does CBD, hemp-related products, right? But you can go in there and essentially it's any cocktail or coffee, and then you can ask them to add CBD to it, and they basically take a tincture or whatever and just add it right in there and mix it up. I don't know if that kind of thing becomes a niche deal, and how does that play into where does it become manufacturing versus retail, right? Like if you're putting it into the gummy or something, that's a manufacturing. If you're adding it to a coffee like that, I don't want to overthink it. The real question there is there anything there that triggers this gray area or a loophole that we need to look at?
Yeah, Keith, that's actually a great question in terms of establishing some baseline knowledge, right? Because the difference there is twofold, really. On one hand, we have the difference between CBD and THC, right? CBD is associated with the hemp, and then THC is associated with marijuana. It's really what is the difference between the two. And what you're describing is public consumption of CBD, which is legal. And what that would look like if that was THC being added to, say, someone's coffee drink, then that's public consumption of marijuana, which is illegal. And the only alternative to that would be a distinct license type, the hospitality license. And what we've heard direction from council on, as well as advice from the working group, that's really not in the cards at this time.
Great clarification. Thank you.
Maybe this is part and parcel to Keith's question, Lance, but if, for example, we had someone in town who wanted to manufacture a bottled coffee beverage that had THC in it, that would be part of this products manufacturing license category. Is that right?
That is correct. And the subtext there, I believe, is related to the breadth of operations covered by this license type, right? You may have such a business currently operating in a C2 zone, right? And then they decide they want to pursue a marijuana products manufacturer license, and then maybe they would need different zoning. So, but the answer to that question is yes, that would run in the gamut here.
Lance, how as we look to do policies, anything in the processing and manufacturing ultimately equates to a product that ends up being an ingestible for human consumption. As soon as you're in that category, you have state regulatory entities, and usually you have federal regulatory entities, the FDA as an example. We know that at the current state, we don't have, the federal regulatory, but the state of Colorado does have, the MED, we've got the CDPHE, and everything that kind of lends into that to address these sorts of things. So, and then I don't want to speculate, but in likelihood, we'll have an FDA element in the near future. So as we look through the process and regulatory standpoint, how far, like what is our scope in terms of we really just need to stay dialed into the land use and the location and the zoning? And are we making a deliberate effort as a community, or have you had any input or direction to try to create our own policies that go beyond that land use, that start to either compete or try to be redundant to the state level regulatory stuff? I'm trying to gauge scope, I think is what I'm.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Keith. And you've accurately described the food safety relationships there at the state and federal level, and the lack thereof on the federal level. In terms of the scope of this conversation, I think the starting place here is land use in terms of this discussion. In terms of the sum of local regulation, that's going to far exceed just land use, right? I mean, we're certainly looking at licensing, we're looking at enforcement, we're looking at education. But here, I think what we're really looking at are the tools that we think of as familiar to our planning toolkit in terms of regulation of the site and structure, regulation of the location and manner and time, and then limitation on the number and proximity. So I think those are really the tools in our toolkit at this time, if that answers the question.
Well, it starts to, and it actually gets to more of the branches that the root of the question was trying to feed here, and that is when you have those use standards, such as a health regulation for food establishments or food processing and different manufacturing, they so often have an expertise and a thorough understanding of what they require out of a facility, particularly from a building code standpoint and from ingress, egress, and fire suppression and that sort of thing. It sort of is all wrapped up in there, and they refer to the applicable codes. So do we have anything, or how can we either make it so that our local jurisdictions, which haven't historically been as familiar or enjoyed as much expertise in those areas as other regulatories, how do we give our local jurisdictions the tools to defer to those who are experienced in regulating it? Or are we really trying to keep that on a case-by-case basis that our local jurisdictions preside over, particularly fire and building?
Yeah, that's a great question, and Keith, I don't know, it's one that has a discrete answer, and because I think there's some policy questions embedded in there, and some policy choices that are probably worth discussing, and then also potentially the purview of council and others. I would say that there are a few things to keep in mind in that regard. One is that many of those types of reviews do not necessarily differ substantially in the case of marijuana versus other types of uses. So, for example, butane extraction is used to create essential oils in many cases, right? And the actual process and then the regulations thereof need not inherently differ for THC, right? There's a separate licensing process related to marijuana and building a separate zoning, but from building and fire perspective, a lot of that can be pretty consistent, marijuana or not. Additionally, we're fortunate to have some very good expertise in our fire department in terms of experience on the front range with this particular topic. So we do have some of that in the toolkit.
Lance, this is Ken. So it sounds to me, unless I'm wrong, that the thinking is that these will belong in an industrial zone as opposed to other zones. And then it looks like the thing we need to address is, should there be a limit on how many of these facilities we approve in the community, and is there some issue about distancing with this particular type of facility? So has anything been identified about these facilities that would indicate that there's a reason to limit the number or the distancing on them, is my question.
Mr. Scissors, that's a great summary of the decision points that are most pertinent here. And then in terms of background on that, I would offer a couple of thoughts. In terms of distancing, there's not been substantial reasoning behind requiring distancing between these particular facilities, with the exception of, say, odor. I think, and I think that's less of a concern broadly, and just less in scope for products manufacturers than cultivation. But that would be probably a primary reason for buffering. I think the primary reason that has been raised to limit the total number is related to real estate and the available stock of buildings and properties that could accommodate these uses, and then what a large number of these uses would do to that market. And I would certainly look to Tamara to see if she has additional recollections from working group discussions on that. But I would think that those are the two primary things to flag here.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. I don't have a lot more to add, but maybe a little bit more context about kind of the limitations. Is one, it wasn't brought up, I think, as preference to limit, like retail sales obviously is a much more robust discussion on some numerical limits. I think that the assumption is that this is kind of the middle part of the process, if you will. So you're cultivating, then you're processing, and then you're selling. And so this, as an industry, directly relates to how much cultivation and how much sales a community has. So not in itself a driver, if you will, of or kind of warranting that limitation, because it will be limited by what cultivation is occurring as well as what the ultimate sales are. So hopefully that provides a little bit of context why that wasn't a focal point on actual numerical limits. But I think, as Lance said strongly, I think the underscored component here is kind of where in the community as it relates to zoning was really the big point of discussion. And again, to just underscore a little bit what Lance has already said too, is I think the general sentiment is this looks and feels like processing and manufacturing in lots of ways. And although it's a different substance, I think perspective that our fire and building staff have lent is, they regulate it under the fire codes and building codes as they would any other product manufacturing. So didn't really see this as a specific use that would require something above and beyond or something exceptional to what they already see and already inspect, for example, under their fire codes or building codes.
I'm compelled to, go ahead, Ann.
Sorry, I was going to say in that connection, kind of jumping off Tamara's question, from a use table point of view, we allow the current code allows manufacturing operations, including food products operations, as a matter of right in a much wider range of zone districts than just I-1, I-2. So B2, C1, C2, mixed use business park, IO, as well as I-1 and 2. And then we allow even some outdoor operations and storage to occur on a conditional use basis for just general manufacturing production. And so I wondered what the thinking was behind the restriction to simply just I-1 and I-2, especially playing off, Lance, your comment about potential real estate availability. If we're envisioning I-1, I-2 as a place where truly industrial activities take place, and we have such a limited stock of that available under our current zoning map, which you have up in front of us now, and our future comp plan mapping. What's the rationale for limiting this operation just to those districts or those zone categories?
It's an excellent point, Chair Teskey, and certainly a great jumping off point for discussion. I think one of the primary considerations for the working group was minimizing impact and maximizing palatability, right? So insofar as the voters move in this direction and council moves in this direction, what is a reasonable starting point or a one that would be perceived as seeking to minimize impacts. And so I think the thinking was simply an abundance of caution, and the idea that perhaps a B2 zone would not be publicly palatable, and perhaps for good reason. But what you say is 100% accurate, right? That the comparable uses that are not marijuana related are allowed in other zone districts. And so if the approach was not to create a new zone category that said marijuana products manufacturer, but instead to include marijuana products manufacturers in that overall manufacturing category, then the result would be allowing it in many more zones.
Yeah, Lance, I actually think it might be a good tool. I don't know if you're able to open the zoning code in the use table. But to Andrew's point, one, we already do have marijuana related businesses for manufactured group into our code, but there are no areas in which it's an allowed use, obviously. So I think it is helpful to look at that and see how that potentially could or could not align with similar types of uses in that same those same zone districts and categories. So I don't know if you're able to scroll to that here quickly, but that visual may actually help that conversation to Chairman Teskey's point.
Yeah, Tamara, here that is, and I would just highlight, we have with our indoor and our outdoor, we have these manufacturing and processing. With the indoor, as Chair Teskey said, we've got C2 and such, and then with food products, it's more expansive, and certainly as we get all indoor, it increases. The other thing that I would highlight is that the hazardous use, insofar as any one of these uses would be hazardous, would require a conditional use permit, as any hazardous use does.
So can I add a little bit of anecdotal information as well as we consider the limited real estate of industrial and what the impacts are of combining both the processing as well as then the food manufacturing into this one category that we're then trying to put a box around, right? The food manufacturing, once the bulk ingredients have been pulled from the plant material, then that's what gets either infused into foods or bottled into gel caps or tinctures and things of that nature. The bottling and the food and everything else, there's nothing hazardous associated with that. It's much along the lines of baking bread or whatever the case may be, right? Nothing hazardous. The processing side and pulling those bulk ingredients out of the plant is where you have some more hazardous operations and more industrial processing. So there may be some consideration to how those two are very different when we're talking about, do we lump them all into one and then say it's only industrial or not? And the thing that starts to almost create an enhancement to the concern about how much real estate does it take up is that currently in our community, we don't have large manufacturing plants that can address the flammable liquids and those things that are used in the processing of this plant. And it's not because those things that are used are any more wild and exotic than anything else out there, but in order to get to scale and create a real business out of it rather than more of a mom and pop shop, you go over certain thresholds of how much of those flammable liquids you may have on site. And it triggers these major building codes and otherwise. So what started to be recognized by the hemp industry, for example, is that to have one building and try to do all of the steps of processes it takes to extract the material out and process. I don't want to just get caught up in the word extraction. It started to make more sense to separate that, because any individual station doesn't necessarily have a lot of those elements that start to trigger different building codes and fire codes and everything else. So there is a consideration that for those processing side of things, utilizing multiple different buildings or different sites, by one company trying to process it through, starts to be much more palatable and able to get operational. It's not to say that it can't be done, but because of that regulatory hurdles of fire and building to go through that, it's a multi-year implementation process, and getting that industry into our community in the state that it's at, it's not a stabilized deal. Speed and innovation is a factor. So I wanted to share that just to sort of add those pieces to the puzzle and speak to, is there any merits to breaking these two things out so that they're not just one package and one line on this use table? Or does one really end up being, food products or food manufacturing related to marijuana, and then the manufacturing and processing related to marijuana, and do the zone opportunities vary with those because of our concerns about consuming limited real estate for industrial job bases and economic factors in that regard?
Keith, there was a lot there. I'm going to take one small piece of that and focus on the conversation about splitting these into different categories. And I think what you are referring to for splitting is that those that are the hazardous activity versus the non-hazardous. And I think when we talk about that, it's in context of how the fire code determines something to be hazardous. That's certainly how our current zoning code is written. And so wanted to just be clear that, looking at this use table, that as currently authored and how we currently look at uses is, again, looking across the chart here, if it's an allowable use, it's an allowable use. What is, and I think Lance noted earlier, is that if it's also hazardous, then it requires a conditional use permit. So I think, to your point, is the code already differentiates between kind of the non-hazardous versus the hazardous categories. And I know we'd started, maybe as a little bit of an aside, a conversation on whether we need to continue that CUP process for hazardous materials, but to, I think, the existing point and the existing construct of our code is the code does that right now. Is, for those elements that would be non-hazardous, it would be, again, an allowed use, at least if we're looking at consistency here with other industrial uses. However, if it's also hazardous, it would require that CUP review.
That's a really good point, because then it could speak to the concerns that might limit these operations to industrial areas. If we can effectively communicate that by its inherent properties and the mechanisms in which to do it, it was going to have to be in an industrial zone as soon as it becomes a hazard thing right off the bat. And therefore, it might make the conversation about anything broader than an I1 or I2 in order to not consume the industrial real estate for the 50% or maybe more of this category that would be the true food manufacturing, right, rather than the processing, because it's hard to tell in that industry what the demand or call for, the processing at the marijuana level is.
Yeah, and Lance, I was wondering if you might have some information that you could speak to that. And again, I haven't gotten the impression through communication with other municipalities that this is a huge industry that creates lots of rooftops or, a demand for a huge amount of industrial space. Lance may have maybe some harder detail and data to support that, but I guess I haven't heard that this really absorbs, if you will, a large industrial complex or sites. I think we certainly have heard that on the cultivation end of the possibility for that, but maybe Lance, you can speak to the products manufacturing component and kind of maybe absorption or scale of the businesses itself.
Yeah, Tamara, happy to speak to that. So, commissioners, as Tamara indicated, the number of products manufacturers is going to be closely related to the number of cultivations, either within the jurisdiction or locally, broadly speaking, right? So certainly there are communities like Pueblo, city and county, Trinidad, to some extent, La Plata County, where you have a relatively substantial number of manufacturers because either in that jurisdiction or neighboring jurisdictions, you have a number of cultivations. And what you're likely not going to see for logistical reasons is a large number of manufacturers absent a local presence of cultivators. The other thing to keep in mind here is that while the food product infusers may be extremely distinct at face value from the extractors, which are so often but not always hazardous uses, the license required from the state remains the same and equally stringent. And so if you are say you're, Dr. Joe's gummy bear manufacturing plant, and you've been manufacturing gummy bears for 100 years, and you decide now I'm going to put THC in our gummy bears, you don't get to do that without getting the same license from the state of somebody that's going to be extracting, hundreds of pounds of THC concentrate every month. You have to use the same license. And so while the license type does not necessarily have to map one-to-one with how it appears in the zoning code, that hurdle is still going to exist, and it's not just easy plug and chug for an existing food manufacturer.
Lance, thanks for that. I think that's a great point, that we don't have to correspond our zone code regulations necessarily to the way MED or whoever is issuing licenses at either at the state or local level, or what those things are called. And I think it's a great point here that we already distinguish from our code standpoint between hazardous operations, which are conditional uses and only in 3 zone districts, whereas non-hazardous manufacturing uses have a much broader use of right under our existing code for any manufacturing. I think your points about why we might want to deviate from that in the marijuana manufacturing area make a lot of sense, but it seems like it seems there are already mechanisms in place to control the sort of the location and the use of right kind of massive 10,000 foot view zone code control over manufacturing seems to be working pretty well on a community-wide basis already. And this use is not terribly different from those uses that are already regulated this way. There may be reasons to constrict them even further, but I guess my point here would be for marijuana-related business manufacturing as proposed, the current use table that we're looking at here in that marijuana-related business item where we have no allowed uses, in both there and there, both indoor and outdoor, right? This is going to maybe have some letters in it now. And if we put allowed uses over on the right-hand side of the chart in I1, I2, that's going to be much more restrictive than our current allowed uses for food product manufacturing, for example, there on the second line of the use table chart. And we already have conditional use requirements for hazardous use. So that seems to be the recommendation of the working group and of staff, that we limit it that far, that we put these all in I1, I2. And partly it sounds like that's palatability, and partly that is a intended constriction on where these types of businesses can go. Is that right?
Chair Teskey, I think you hit the nail on the head across the board there. The options I think are at this point relatively clear, and it's a point of policy and recommendation at that point with those pieces on the table. But the thing I would just underscore is that it is not a one-to-one between hazardous and extraction. And as long as you have that clearly in your head, then I think, the policy choice is clear.
Is it the extraction that principally has odor-related issues, Lance?
It is, and each extraction method is associated with different kinds and amounts of odors, as well as different potential for VOCs or volatile organic compounds, which of course produce ozone only in connection with NOx. So, which is just to say that the odor varies, the techniques vary, and it's probably also important to know that odor is not necessarily higher with the hazardous uses. Actually, to the contrary, many of the less hazardous extraction methods produce more odor in terms of it actually smelling like marijuana.
So it
Yeah.
sounds like there might be some reason for us to distinguish from a zone code standpoint between extraction activities and non-extractive activities, independent of whether they're hazardous or, H occupancies from a fire code standpoint, in order to try to effectuate some odor control if that's an issue we decided needed regulation.
Yeah, Chair Teskey, I think that leads to a couple of strategies. I mean, one is, as I had kind of indicated before, one option would be to include in the definition of food products manufacturing, including marijuana infusion, right? And then to include in manufacturing and processing, or in a separate category, marijuana manufacturing processing, explicitly define that as including or encompassing extraction. And that might be a good tool to differentiate. I do think you're going to get less of the odor challenge with the food product infusion.
And if I can speak to the latter part on the odor, I think the conversation from our last conversation on cultivation rolls into this a little bit on the odor. And I think that, like anything, we would want some very clear standards, development standards that are associated with this. And that concept of no perceptible odor is likely going to be important here, as it was in the cultivation discussion. And that's something from a use standards standpoint, it's very easy to author. And then we can talk probably more at length, like we did last time in cultivation, about the actual enforcement of that. But to me, that the enforcement piece is a little bit of a separate component, although relevant. So I'll stop there.
Can I ask, as we're considering and just kind of throwing things against the wall to see where we want to really kind of dial in here, and right now some of it seems to be about we expand into more than just the industrial for one reason, so as to not to consume the industrial. But where does this plug into part of the conversation we had previously that is more generic to the entire marijuana industry, which is buffers? And if we start to apply buffers to certain corridors and schools and parks, how much of our industrial or other zones do we inherently preserve through more of a boilerplate buffer policy that then starts to alleviate that concern of it being an overwhelming single use for a limited resource like industrial? I mean, do we start to answer that question right there to say somehow we're inherently preserving things? Because I think we were talking about doing that even just from the odor standpoint, whether it related to cultivation or anything else. And it from the corridors that our industrial were on, it seemed like maybe there's inherent preservation of some of those resources.
Yeah, Keith, I can bring this map back. I think we saw it last time, and I believe it was Commissioner Katsos who noticed that if we look at kind of this draft set of buffers, which really tracks on to many of the Front Range municipalities and some of the state recommendations, but is subject to change, you're not getting as much out of these buffers as it relates to the industrial here appearing in green as you do when we start looking at sales locations being in more of the essentially commercial areas, right? So what we're seeing is, frankly, a lot of the area that gets buffered out, so to speak, in terms of industrial is already non-industrial.
But wasn't part of that conversation last time too, that these buffers were based on schools, churches, and parks. And we started to say, hey, what would this look like if we preserved some of our corridors? And so I'm going on memory here, so help me out, guys. But we talked about I-70. We talked about the Riverside Parkway. I think we talked about around the mall. Some of those, you start to put those same buffering scenarios in those areas, and maybe it does start to preserve certain certain industrial.
Yeah, on our discussion, Keith, you're absolutely right. I think we did talk about the transportation corridors and other areas, not just the schools and churches and parks there, but I think Keith has a good idea. I think, buffering gives us another tool that we can utilize the good planning. Lance, did your working group discuss any of that?
Absolutely. And I would say that one of the buffers that came up in relation to both cultivation and processing was, let's keep it out of gateways. So I think that was spoken to in terms of Horizon Drive, I-70, and then B, keep it away from Riverside Parkway and essentially the Rail and River District there in the south, which leaves, frankly, a pretty relatively limited amount of area, predominantly in the northwest area of town. For this.
And then Lance, the other area that I was concerned about at our last meeting was the airport regional area. And I don't know what the mix is of light industrial there, or industrial versus C2, but I think that's an important area too.
Absolutely, Commissioner Gassis, you did mention that last time, and certainly what you see here is I-1 and I-2 in green. So that's the current stock of industrial there in the airport horizon area.
Hey, can I ask something here? I'm getting a little confused as to what really we're talking about here. I haven't really heard any particular reason to buffer, limit, space these processing plants. They're just going to look like buildings that something industrial is going on the inside. I don't think people are going to be aware of them particularly, and I don't see that they pose any harm to the public any more than any other, manufacturing plant might, which is minimal, if any. And there's ordinances to manage odors and toxic fumes and all such things. So just on an objective basis, I don't really understand why our current ordinances and zoning wouldn't manage this just like it would any other type of chemical or industrial process, except that this is marijuana. And it seems to be like there's a concern about how this might affect how the public might perceive it or something like that. So are we supposed to be making recommendations that include kind of like a strategy to get public approval for this? Or are we just supposed to be interpreting the rules and the objective factors and saying, as if it had already passed? I thought that's what we're supposed to be doing. Assuming this passes, then, what do the ordinances say about where they would fit in? But I'm hearing this other element of, well, how's it going to look to the public? So I'm just a little confused. Sorry.
No problem at all, Commissioner Scissors. And I think while you framed that as confusion, what you've really done is stated a position that speaks exactly to the question at hand. The question at hand is how, from a land use regulation perspective, should these businesses be regulated? How should the tools be adapted, or as you're saying, potentially the position that Planning Commission may take is that there is no need to substantially differentiate between marijuana processing and other types of processing business. And that is a fine and viable recommendation, and I think serves to answer the question at hand.
I would second that. And Ken, I think your point is perfectly articulated, and I'm 100% on board with you. The effort to answer kind of the initial question is, why and what are we talking about? For the comment of, are we concerned about this thing somehow overtaking the limited resources we have in our limited space for industrial? Then the following conversation was to run some ideas up the flagpole on how we might mitigate that if it is a concern. But I'm totally behind what I think I understood your comments to be, in that the code already references how to handle manufacturing or food production. Furthermore, there are other adopted codes and regulatory elements between CDPHE and eventually FDA, right down to fire department, fire codes and building codes that inherently rein this in. So if we don't have a glaring concern about somehow this being consumptive of our industrial uses, and if it is that's somehow bad, then boy, I'm right with you. We're overthinking this and maybe getting a little bit too over regulatory as a government.
Yeah, if I can, thank you, Lance and Keith. I totally agree with what you just said there. I would think the market and our current regulatory structure should take care of it. And my concern is that the worries about the public and optics and so forth is a result of conflating the processing, manufacturing end of it with the retail end of it. And because the way the ballot measure is coming out, where it's not really distinguishing, then it's kind of lumped in there. And I think I think it would have been clearer for us if the three types of uses were separated out and we could just treat each one on their merits. But if there is concern that they could get conflated, because obviously there is reasons for buffering and a lot of other public benefit versus harm concerns about retail and consumption. But those don't really exist, as far as I know, with the manufacturing end of it. That's just a manufacturing thing, and we can decide whether to smoke it here or send it somewhere else to be smoked. So I don't know, maybe I'm just free flowing here, so I'll shut up.
Commissioner Scissors, I think that's very helpful, and my suggestion at this point, given the time, is that we, it depends on whether we're going to 1 or 1:30, but maybe that we set this down for now, having laid out a variety of perspectives, maybe touch on some of the options for stores and sales briefly, and then set ourselves up to be able to speak to all three license types on the 26th. And I would suggest that, but I would look to direction.
Yeah.
Hey, Lance, just real briefly, I just have a question. In regards to Commissioner Scissors' good points, I've been trying to listen, and it seems like the real two issues is the hazardous, which is handled by conditional use permit, and the odors. Is that correct? And besides the lack of industrial zone area, I'm talking about concerns.
Yeah, Commissioner Gatzos, I would say that aligns pretty well with my technical understanding of what's at hand, although I would be extremely hesitant in my position to say that public perception somehow has nothing to do with this decision. I don't know that that's the case. I think there may be folks that identify other factors, but I think that summarizes it out.
Okay, thank you.
And Lance, if I may suggest too, I'd hate to move past this issue without maybe getting some more clear direction from the Planning Commission. And I think to Commissioner Scissors' point, I saw several heads nodding. with the what I would loosely call a recommendation that this is treated similar to other industrial uses. And so want to just make sure that if there appears to be consent or consensus on that, that we can actually put a little bit of a check in the box and move on, knowing that that's the general direction. And obviously the authoring of the exact text, we will want to come back with you on, but if that's general direction, I don't want to put Commissioner Weckerly on the spot, but I don't know that we've heard from you in the process. So if you've got other thoughts or just a general head nod that seems like the right direction, then that would be really great to know. So I think we'll have a good launching off point to ultimately bring back essentially a draft of what that would look like for products manufacturing in these zone districts.
I mean, I agree mostly with what Ken has been saying and agree that to move forward in that way myself, but.
That's really helpful. And I see Commissioner Hates just joined us. Thanks so much for joining. And I hate to put her on the spot because she hasn't had the benefit of hearing the discussion, so we can circle back with her. But if that's the general direction from this planning commission, it's really helpful. And I think that gives us some really good points to look at for the manufacturing products piece. And that's nice to have that under our belt in some ways. So Lance, would look to you if there's anything else on this topic on the products manufacturing that you need maybe a little additional guidance on. And then I think, as you suggested, pivot to the retail sales component. And do just want to do a time check. I think we talked about this rolling to 1:30, so I want to make sure that we have folks that are able to join until the 1:30 timeline. Thumbs up. Awesome.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's very valuable. And I don't know that there's more to flag. I will certainly continue to provide you with background information and some of this best practice information as well. But we'll mosey our way on to what I think of as the boss level of this video game, which is the sales question. And I'll jump back onto my slideshow here. Let's see. So here you see the inside of marijuana dispensary, and we'll talk about those. I would just make a note in terms of terminology. This is where, again, we get real challenged by the term of art for recreational being retail. So, of course, when we talk about sales, we can talk about retail sales and medical sales, and they both essentially look like this. But retail is that recreational, non-medical type. And then you'll also hear the word dispensary used, as that was particularly from kind of the period of 2000 2012, was the word used in relation to the medical marijuana sales locations. Like the other types of licenses, stores require a dual licensing. So they need a license from the state as well as from the local jurisdiction. And the working group considered these and certainly came up with a recommendation that tracked staffs relatively well, which was that these are most likely appropriate, if they are appropriate, in the C1 and C2 commercial zone districts, as well as the B2 or downtown business zone district, subject as well to the recommendation of the DDA and downtown businesses. What we've heard in presenting this information to the DDA has been almost without exception support for including B2 and potentially adding a limit on the number of stores within the downtown, or even within various districts downtown. There was talk of, well, maybe there's one in the downtown core, one in Las Colonias, and one in Dos Rios, but that was just a suggestion that was thrown out. So generally, there's interest from downtown representation that B2 be included. And then with stores, there is a whole variety of use-specific standards that I think are more relevant here and potentially more detailed here than with the other license types. So there's the question of visual impact. There's the question of stores' proximity to schools, places of worship, parks. There's a question of their proximity to one another. Certainly communities like Trinidad have taken some heat for establishing what have affectionately been come to call in Trinidad Marijuana Row, which is a section of their downtown, which just has 4 stores all next to each other. And then all sorts of signage and building regulations that could be looked at, as well as a numerical cap, which I think, as I believe I mentioned, City Council's policy on that is that there should be a maximum 6 sales locations. This current council has discussed that as applying to retail locations, and I'm not entirely sure whether that was intended to mean recreational or sales. So those are some of the options at hand, and here are maybe a starting point as to some of those that we might discuss. Happy to provide more background on how these stores work and such, but I think that may be relatively general knowledge. So with that, I think we can start with any of these. I do suspect that a numerical cap is the longest and most challenging discussion here, in addition to buffers, and then these others might be a little easier to address, but I would look to you, Chair Teske, as to where you want to jump in.
Well, I obviously looking to my fellow commissioners here for their commentary on some of these other things, but several of these items seem to me to be fairly well regulated already with respect to other types of retail operation that we have going in the city. Signage, building appearance, we have a variety of requirements on building appearance in various corridors, parking requirements, hours of operation. I guess that would be the closest issue. I really see, and we've talked about odor mitigation already, and I think that one, with respect to the idea that we would have a general requirement on marijuana businesses that they not have perceptible odors, then I don't know what else we need to talk about in those regards. So I guess I'd see the issues as numerical cap, buffering, and then possibly hours of operation as topics of conversation, maybe in that order.
What about clustering versus dispersing locations?
Yeah,
Commissioner Scissors, I would just.
That's a great question, and to my mind, that's about buffering. That's about buffer from the same use. So, are we going to buffer from types of uses where we don't want marijuana sales activity happening? I think that's sort of a no-brainer. Of course, we want that. But we probably also want buffering from a similar use so that they're not all clustered up together in one place. That'd be my impression.
Chair
So
Teske,
additional-
what about, what, should we have a discussion with the differences in the zone from the staff to the working group? My interest would be a discussion on the mixed use corridor zone.
I think that's a great question and probably relates to some extent to our buffering and clustering concept as well. So I think that's a good point. Sounds like the working group thought mixed use was a place to allow this as of right, and staff doesn't agree. Is that right, Lance?
Yeah, Chair Teske, commissioners, the mixed use zoning in the community is A, not particularly prevalent, and B, is somewhat complex. And so, as you'll see in the legend here, there's really the 3 that are identified, or 4 rather. There's mixed use, MU, which is distinct from these MX or mixed use form districts. And so the suggestion was that only the MXOC corridor, that mixed use opportunity corridor zone district, be included. One of the reasons I think in the staff discussion for discluding that was A, it doesn't include a substantially greater area. It's also not going to include parcels that could not otherwise be rezoned to C1 or C2. And we believe it would generate unnecessary confusion just because of its rarity and relative complexity.
Well, I just would put my opinion in. I would go with the staff recommendations. I think that with the C1, C2, and is it B2 would be appropriate for, especially for probably the numerical cap. I would like to not see it in the mixed use at all.
Can I ask, has there been any discussion on if there is a numerical cap, which seems to be a pretty prevalent element of this conversation, how will those get chosen? And the reason I ask is to take a lesson from how Palisade did theirs, in which that application process, because there was it was a lottery system and or a numerical cap that was solved or derived by a lottery system, you had to have your property established and show control over it and whatnot, which then if you have to have your property beforehand and then you go into the lottery system, or depending on how we choose to elect the numerical gap, even if it's by a merit system, do two people that chose properties right next to each other, now we have this buffer element. Does it force that decision-making committee or decision-making process to look at two people that conflicted in their properties as to whether or not they're going to get one of the sought after licenses? Or do we, if there's been enough discussion, then all of the policies that we're talking about here between buffering amongst other things, but also amongst each other, then we better take into consideration how that affects the decision-making process for who gets those, and whether or not somebody needs to kind of have a site already picked out and include that in the review process or not, because that can really be an inadvertent negative that, as we kind of saw in Palisade, and it's debatable, of course, maybe not everybody agrees, but it rendered whoever won and the properties they chose or whatever they could get to at that point, that's where they went in. And in fact, they didn't even get their third one done because of it, instead of deciding that there was going to be a number of permits, and then that those select few can go choose their sites within. So has that conversation tied into this at all yet?
Commissioner Ellers, the short answer to your very last question there is a resounding yes. And I will provide a little bit of background on the mechanics and limitations of actually administering a numerical cap on the number of sales locations, but would certainly and humbly suggest that we not get too deep into the weeds on that today, except to evaluate the extent to which a numerical cap is desirable at all. But I will provide a little bit of background. So of course, the first option is, do you set a cap or do you not? If you opt to set a cap, then your second question is, okay, what is the cap? And then once you've established that, you have another question, which is, how should the cap be administered? And you have really two basic approaches to that are common and well hashed out. One is the lottery, as you mentioned, and then the other is a competitive process that would function like an RFP process. We'd put out a request for interest. We would establish some criteria, and those criteria could be relatively baseline and technical. They could also be policy oriented. For example, the city of Denver has as one of their criteria that a cultivation or manufacturing location be 100% operated on renewable energy. So there's that element on the RFP process, but the reality is that the lottery and the competitive process are both fallible in different ways. Both have apparently led to legal challenge. You can see how that might arise, there is a massive conversation to be had there. We're having it right now with an expert city clerk on this topic who operated this process in Commerce City. This is all to say that in choosing to have a cap, whether it goes lottery or competitive, there is sure to be a challenging path forward in terms of defining the details of that. But with that in mind, I think it relatively unwise to jump straight to that question. I think we want to stick with the 4 questions that were outlined for our short-term discussion here. And then as we get a better wrap our heads around what a cap might intend to accomplish in terms of number and such, then we should talk about process, because that's the Siberian gulag of this conversation.
Well, Lance,
That makes sense, Lance. Can I add one more thing though? Because another lesson that was learned at both Palisade and other areas is speculative zoning. If we just stick to the 4 that we've got right now and say that we might allow it in this kind of zoning with this kind of buffering, there may be a lot of properties, or historically in other locations, there's been incidences of properties coming in and asking for a rezone for no other reason than to make their property available for a potential use in this thing, and the economics that come with it. That's what happens anytime you start to limit things numerically. So if we're talking about zoning and buffering and where, do we need to talk about referencing a current zoning map, or are we okay with speculative zoning and converting a property zone-wise based on the new comprehensive plan? What is everybody's thoughts on that?
Commissioner Ullers, if I actually may respond before the planning commissioner. So I've got a few thoughts, and I'm sure others do here as well. As one, as a property owner is right, they can come in and request to rezone at any point in time. And we actually see this fairly often, and speculative, maybe not for this one use, but certainly speculative for other types of uses. And so I would not recommend, or I guess suggest, any change to process. I think that's certainly a property owner's right to request the zoning that they think is best suited for theirs. Certainly we would compare that against our comprehensive plan to make sure it's accurate. I believe, frankly, the task at hand is really to make sure that you all are comfortable with the zone districts that would allow it, and understanding the purpose of those zone districts and where they actually physically align on our city map here, I think is also important. So when you think about corridors or other service areas, those types of things, I think to me, those are really the root of the conversation about what type of zoning is most compatible and aligns with the purpose of that zone district. And then certainly the ability and understanding that people do have that right to come and request zoning changes at any point in time.
Reeling in that scope really helps. Thanks. Makes sense.
Yeah, that was real helpful. On that, I have a question. How does the proposed zoning compare to the zoning of liquor stores and tobacco stores, which seem to me to be similar or comparable issues?
Yeah, I'll grab that here in the use table, because certainly that discussion has taken place, and not just in terms of zoning, but also in terms of some of the buffering standards and some of the other due diligence that is done with those liquor license locations. I believe it's under alcohol sales. Is that right, Tamara?
I think it is, but let's double check. We did just do that fairly recent code modification. Scrolling through here as well.
Distinct from the drinking establishment. Sorry, we don't have that at the tips of our fingers there, Commissioner Scissors.
I thought liquor store stayed under that term. Did you do a search for liquor?
I did.
I actually I don't know that we differentiate on retail sales of liquor from others. So hopefully I don't get proved wrong here as I skim back through the use table, but let me take a quick look.
Yeah, Tamara, I believe you're correct. I think, with the liquor licensing, you have that additional process. And so much like you have the hazardous use requiring a CUP on top of those other requirements, in that case, you'd have this liquor license requirement just layered on the general retail sales. But we should be better armed with that. Apologies.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because making marijuana legal in Colorado as well as other places often falls back to the argument is, well, how is that any different than alcohol, which is already legal? So I'm not, it sounds a little bit like it would sound to me like a little bit of a double standard to not, allow legal marijuana businesses the same zoning and buffering and all the other things that we do for alcohol and tobacco, which are have the same issues about wanting to keep them away from youth and abuse potential and all of that. But it does seem common to have a different standard for marijuana. I guess I'm just not sure I really understand it.
Commissioner Scissors, I think that's certainly a point that tracks with the position you stated on a previous discussion on manufacturing and processing, and would underscore that the Amendment 64, which created the recreational marijuana laws, explicitly was designed and worded as a request by the people to regulate marijuana in a manner similar to alcohol. So certainly that there's a legal basis for what you're describing.
Yeah, and if I may just circle back on the question about how we zone or look at retail sales of alcohol, we don't differentiate. So I did just double check here in the zoning code. And I think to maybe even a more apropos point is that, with the recent legislation on how and where alcohol sales can take place, as you know, those are taking place in grocery stores today. So there is no differentiation from the general topic or a separate zone category for alcohol. Alcohol, and as you guys recall, drinking establishments being different, right? So we did just do those recent text amendments to address kind of the modern brewery or brew pub type of uses that we're seeing kind of evolve in today's zoning codes, but the retail sales, no.
So that would, I think, speak to what I was trying to get at earlier, that for the retail, it's really not just, okay, let's look at our comparable existing codes and zones and go with those. That there's much more of a subjective component to this, and community input would be really needed, because the question wouldn't be for us so much as it would be for if we have retail, how does the community want to see that be, how much, and in what locations and stuff like that. So I think it would be really hard for us to speak for the people on that, because it's subjective and not objective.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Ken, and having gone through this process and conversation now, if we were to go back to that first slide with the items where we were talking about, okay, where do we tackle first? Please don't let me speak on behalf of everybody else, but the way I see it is that we've kind of checked these things off to where between the licensing elements and the rules about not any public consumption and these other codes that make it similar to a liquor license or things of that nature, we kind of narrow it down to what's the number, and then that following question of, if that's the number, where do we want these things to go? And now, is it, we use the term clustering, or do we disperse it? And if we disperse it, do we do that through buffering, or are we doing that through kind of carving the town up into these different districts, as we once had a map of? Is that kind of where we've landed and where we've kind of funneled into?
From my standpoint, Keith, I agree with you. I think that's sort of where we're at, is to discuss the question of how do we control the location and numerosity of these uses. And I suppose there's a threshold question. Should we control the location and numerosity of these uses? Are they types of uses that are different enough from other similar types of retail sales operations that they need special regulation? For what it's worth, my view is yes, they do require some sort of special treatment over and above other types of retail use. But we could do that by limiting the allowed uses in the zone use table, such that they were only available in C1, C2, and B2 zones. That's going to significantly limit the land that they can appear on. We've talked about buffers, and we've seen that buffer map that Lance has shown up with the orange bubbles a few times. That one was compared to industrial land, but if you overlaid that to the C1, C2, B2 map, I assume we'd see a large amount of that land cut up by the buffer, actually. And that then raises the question, well, if we buffer them also, and I think, Lance, you had done maybe 2 or 3 presentations on this issue ago, and you'll have to excuse my bad memory here. You had done, I think, a grid type analysis of what a buffer would look like on potential retail uses in these zones. And I can't remember what the buffer space was, but had concluded that there were maybe 45 or so viable sites in the city based on that sort of presumptive grid-spaced buffering. And I think that's sort of where, in my mind, that's sort of where the conversation should pick up is, all right, we have these maybe 45 or so potential sites. Obviously, if we increase the clustering or increase, yeah, this is it. If we increase the detail if we increase the buffer, what was the buffer used on this one, Lance?
Chair Teske, it varies depending on whether it's schools, churches, or parks. So I believe we have 500 from parks, 500 from churches, and 2,000 from schools, and then 2,000 between locations.
I was mostly interested in the between locations one, but there was 2,000 feet between?
Correct.
Okay. So, I mean, taking a look at this map, was I right? It's about 45 locations or so?
Yeah, spot on.
Okay. Yay. So if that's what we're looking at, and City Council's direction in their recitals from yesterday evening is they want about 6 of these stars to show up, or no more than 6 of these stars to show up. To Keith's point, one way to handle that would be to consider increasing the buffering. I would observe, for example, that there are some clusters here. When you look at this buffering kind of base map, there are some clusters principally in the along the 6 and 50 corridor between the city center and Northwest. There's a cluster of stars in the Horizon Drive area, one out in Fruitvale, and one sort of North Avenue west of the city center. And then we've got one in the Orchard Mesa area. So we're looking at, I mean, that almost naturally lends itself to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 areas. Given the concentration in the 6 and 50 corridor, maybe there ought to be 2 in there, just because that's where we have the principal concentration of our C1, C2, and B2 zone property. But anyway, I thought this map was maybe a better place to jump off discussing numerical cap, and then how we might do that, either by creating these areas where 1 or 2 sales establishments could be located, or just by buffering them far enough from each other. You know, if you increase the buffer from 2,000 feet to 10,000 feet, you're going to get a much smaller number of stars.
Yes, I think you're right on, and I stop me, Lance, please, if I'm drifting back to that other area. But if we look at all those things that we talked about on how do you do a buffer between each other, and then have to figure it out with the selection process, what that might be, with these buffers that you put out, and the green area showing the C1, C2, and the others there. If you said something like you could have 1 store in each one of these districts, so to speak, it could then furthermore be another immediate revenue generator, and I might even squint with myself if I look at this later on. But the application processes for other towns has been a source of a nice little influx as well, because you charge a fairly significant fee just to get your ticket in the pot kind of thing. And now a person could choose to just be in one district or to do separate applications for each one. And now you would never encounter a scenario where you have two licenses issued within one district, and now you got to figure out who gets which property and how we buffer against them. And yet we could achieve that very thing by doing so. So forgive me if I drifted back over into that lane, but this map's beautiful. And as long as we don't, from a community planning perspective, have any discomfort with segregating our own community in this way instead of some sort of unified approach, then something like that would be, I think I would find that favorable.
What would happen?
I'd like to
if-
jump in. I'm sorry, Ken, go ahead.
Thank you, George. What would happen if we had these buffers and they were filled up with the number allotted, and then somebody wanted to build a church in that area, or was decided that be a good location for a new school because the area is growing, or something of that? In other words, sort of the unintended consequences of commandeering a space that certain others that you were trying to protect actually want to be in. How does that play out?
Yeah, Commissioner Scissors, that's an excellent point. And I think, fortunately, that's one that just through a legal and definitional approach could be relatively quickly resolved simply by saying at the time of application. So does this exist at the time of application? And that's the route taken by many other communities where it's,
Hey, Lance, is anybody else having a hard time hearing Lance?
Yeah. Mhm.
With your volume there.
Is that better?
Mhm.
Mic check.
It sounds like your microphone is in your pocket all of a sudden.
Sounds like we're done for the day. Perfect timing. What a coincidence, Lance.
Ken, I think that's a really, really good question to ask is, do we unintentionally inflict harm on uses by trying to protect them? And that pendulum swings both ways. I'd love to hear some feedback on that from staff and other experiences there.
Yeah. So this is the classic example, and I'm sure Chairman Teskey certainly has some perspective to lend on this as well. But this is the classic perspective is when a certain use comes in and conforms today, but over time, for whatever reason, zoning code changes or standards change, they become non-conforming. And so we, in our field, call them a legal non-conforming use, meaning that at the time that they were permitted and became active use, they were legal under today's code, but over time, for whatever reason, they no longer now conform with the set of standards that we have in place. So from a kind of legal perspective, those uses would certainly be allowed to continue, and it really becomes more of kind of the onus of the new use to say, hey, this is an area in which this activity occurs, and they then get to make the choice on whether they proceed with their development or their new building or their new school or not, right? So that's just a selection of location they choose as a new use to decide whether it's appropriate for or not. So hopefully that clarifies for you, Commissioner Scissors, a little bit on how that use works and kind of those changes over the course of time occur.
Tamara, would it be accurate as well that those uses are pretty unique in their own, and the process of a variance would also be available to them to come in and say, hey, yeah, we really want to be in this site. Code says there's this buffer thing. Here's why we want a variance from that, and here's how we intend to mitigate it. Is there still tools available for those very select and very unique uses that we could protect or offer that level of protection?
So I'm not sure that I actually fully understand Commissioner Ellers' the question, and maybe let me just spin it on the head. I think that the buffers work in only one direction. So it's really the citing of new marijuana related businesses, in this case retail sales that we're talking about, that would be subject to those buffers. It doesn't work in the opposite direction, meaning that a church would need to be 500 feet from that facility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally clarifies it for me. Ken, that addresses your question too, right?
That answers my question. It would be their choice.
Correct.
I would also observe that we have a chapter in our zone code about legal non-conforming uses and exactly what happens when those uses are changed or expanded and so forth. And there's a lot of complexity to that. So in light of the time of the day, I hate to dive into that, but that is an issue that we also have existing code on that seems to do a good job for us on existing legal non-conforming use when those issues arise.
So maybe considering the time, as Chairman Teskey said, I think it's time to put a wrap on this for today, but do know we will set aside some time, significant time, and in fact, the entirety of the workshop now on the 26th to talk about this. I will visit with Chairman Teskey too to make sure we have a good understanding of what kind of time we want to assign that evening. So we probably could be there till midnight, but we will try to make it within a little bit more logical and probably acceptable hours of operation for you all. But appreciate the attention. I do think maybe as a quick summary, and certainly we'll turn to Lance if he feels like he heard something different, but generally what the starting point is, it appears is that the C1, C2, and B2 zone districts are a good place to start. And then we can begin tinkering with the other elements, again, buffers, limitations, numerical caps, those kind of things, and really build from that base. So I want to just make sure that I've heard, certainly there's folks on here that haven't weighed in, but I think generally I've seen head nods through that level of discussion. So any comments or concerns about kind of maybe agreeing, if you will, that that's really a foundation for us to build on? Perfect. Lance, anything to wrap up? And then I'll look to you, Chairman Teskey, if there's anything you'd like to conclude with before we adjourn.
Am I audible?
Let's see if we can hear Lance. No, we can't.
Okay, I would like to, well, before we wrap up, just acknowledge Councilmember McDaniel for being here. Obviously, there's a lot of our workshops that don't justify council presence and whatnot, but this is a special one, and it helps provide a lot of context when we pass recommendations up. So I'd like to express some appreciation on being a part of this.
And Chairman Teskey, before we do adjourn, I did want to circle back, and thanks for reminding me, Lance. We had made an offer and extension to see if anybody wanted to take a tour of facilities. And so wanted to make sure for those that are online that we've captured the intent. There was kind of a varying degree of interest. So perhaps I can see, maybe just to keep it simple, a thumbs up on who would like to do a tour of a retail sales facility. Lance, do you want to take notes there? Screenshot. Okay, so we got that. Who would like to take a tour of a products manufacturing facility? Or there, okay. And then who would like to take a tour of a cultivation facility? 3, okay, perfect. So we will be working to set those up. I'm assuming we'll be able to find businesses that will provide tours. considering the current COVID state that we're in. If we're unable, we'll certainly let you know, but we'll certainly be working diligently to get those set up and hopefully be able to offer a couple of times in which those may be available, just to make sure we're accommodating people's schedules. Lance, did you need anything else? Are you good on that? Okay, awesome. Well, Chairman Teskey, I think that concludes from our perspective and information, but if you've got anything, I'll turn it to you.
No, I don't have anything. I saw Councilman McDaniel turned his screen on to say hi to us all. We do appreciate you coming and sitting in on our conversation. I think it's great to have you here to hear what we're talking about, and we appreciate your participation today.
Well, thank you all, and I appreciate it very much. You know, this is new and complicated, and I'm very much impressed with the way you guys are approaching it.
Well, thank you. We appreciate the feedback, and I guess we'll be back at it again next Tuesday night.
I'll try to be there.
Thanks so much.